Three people, three moments where everything they'd spent years building was taken from them in seconds, in front of an audience that was never supposed to be watching. A janitor who showed up before sunrise for 19 years walked out of the building like a criminal while kids stood frozen in the hallway. A human resources analyst who found numbers that were never meant to be found let go 4 days later with a handshake and a smile. And a woman whose family had worked the same land for 3 generations until a corporation from Dallas decided that what was underneath that land was worth a whole lot more than her entire life. Three people who had every reason to walk away and never look back. None of them did. Stay with us, because what happens next will make you question everything you thought you knew about who really holds the power.
The boiler room.
I want you to imagine something. You show up to the same building every single day for 19 years. You know every crack in every wall. You know which hallway floods when it rains hard. You know which classroom gets too cold in February, and you fix it before anyone even notices it's a problem. You know the names of kids whose parents never came to a single school meeting because those kids stayed behind after school and talked to you while you mopped the floors. 19 years. And then one Tuesday morning, a woman you've known for 11 weeks walks up to you in front of 40 children and tells you to hand over your keys. Right now. This is Walter Grimes' story, and I need you to hear every single word of it.
Walt Grimes got to work at 5:47 every morning, every single day, for 19 years. Not because the contract required it. His shift didn't start until 6:30. But Walt had a habit. Before any staff member walked through those doors, he'd make one slow lap through the building, coffee in hand, checking the lights, the heat, the doors. Garfield Elementary in Des Moines, Iowa had 312 students, 23 staff members, and a building that had been standing since 1961. It needed constant attention. Walt knew every inch of it better than any architect who'd ever set foot there. He knew the third step on the east staircase creaked louder when the temperature dropped below freezing, and that it scared the younger kids in winter. So every fall before the cold hit, he'd tuck a piece of rubber underneath it. He knew the faucet in the second-floor men's bathroom dripped exactly every 8 seconds, and that if you didn't shut the auxiliary valve on Friday afternoon, you'd come back Monday morning to a wet floor. He knew Mrs. Patterson in 3rd grade always kept her window cracked open because she ran hot, and that in winter, that one window made the central heating work 40% harder. So he installed a temperature regulator on that window himself, bought it out of pocket, never mentioned it to anyone, never asked to be paid back. 19 years, no award, no plaque on the wall, no mention in the school newsletter, just Walt. And the building he kept standing. In September of 2024, Dr. Rebecca Halston took over as principal of Garfield Elementary, 38 years old. MBA in Educational Management from Drake University. 2 years as a district consultant before the appointment. She came in with a clear mandate from the superintendent: modernize, reduce costs, improve metrics. Walt met her that first Monday. She walked right past him in the main hallway without a word. On Tuesday, he cleaned up the coffee she spilled near the entrance. She didn't look back. On Wednesday, she sent a school-wide email asking that support staff use only the side entrance. Support staff. Walt had keys to every entrance in the building, but starting that Wednesday, he used the side door. Over the next few weeks, Rebecca launched what she called an operational efficiency review. She brought in an outside consulting firm to analyze the school's maintenance costs. Walt was called into a 20-minute meeting where a 27-year-old consultant who had never operated a boiler in his life asked him if he could justify his hours with, and I quote, documented metrics. Walt didn't have documented metrics. What he had was 19 years of a building that had never once shut down due to structural failure, not a single day. But that wasn't a metric. It was a Tuesday in November, 9:17 in the morning. Walt was in the first-floor hallway, replacing a fluorescent bulb that had been flickering for a week. Mrs. Chen's fourth-grade class was filing past on their way to P.E. A few of the kids waved at him. He waved back. That's when Dr. Rebecca Halston turned the corner. Behind her, a district security officer Walt had never seen before, and the administrative assistant who couldn't bring herself to look at him. Rebecca stopped about 6 feet away. "Mr. Grimes, we need to talk." The kids stopped walking. Mrs. Chen went completely still. "Your position has been eliminated as part of the operational restructuring. Your services will no longer be needed as of today. Please hand your keys to Mr. Morrison," she pointed to the security officer, "and collect your personal belongings. You have 30 minutes. Walt stood there, the bulb still in his hand, 40 kids watching him. "Today?" That was all he managed to say. "Today?" she confirmed, and turned her back. The security officer stepped forward. Walt looked at the kids. A girl in 4th grade, Amara, whose name he knew because she waited in the hallway for her mom every single Friday, had tears running down her face. Walt lowered his head, placed the key ring in the officer's hand, and walked out through the side entrance. Walt Grimes lived 4.2 miles from the school. He knew the exact distance because for 19 years he'd calculated the commute to make sure he was never late. He walked home. Not because he didn't have a car. He did. A 2009 Chevrolet Silverado he maintained himself. But that morning he needed to walk. He got through the front door at 10:43. The house was quiet in that specific way a house gets when it's supposed to be empty, but it isn't. His daughter, Patrice, 31 years old, called at 11 when he didn't respond to her good morning text. She sent one every single day without fail. He didn't pick up, called her back at 11:22 and said he was fine, that he needed a little time. She was at his door by 12:15. She found her father sitting at the kitchen table. In front of him, a cold cup of coffee, and a black spiral notebook with a worn cover that she had never seen before in her life. "Dad, what is that?" Walt took a moment before he answered. "It's what I did after my shift," he said. 19 years of what I did after my shift. Patrice opened the notebook. The first page had a date, March 14th, 2005, and a name, Jerome A. 3rd grade. Reading level, 1, goal, level 3 by June. Next page, Destiny M, 4th grade, multiplication tables through 6. Struggles with 7 and 8. Practices out loud, page after page after page, name, grade, struggle, progress, completion date, and on some of them, a single line written after the name, went to college, September 2019, or full scholarship, University of Iowa, 2022. 23 names with that line. Patrice turned the pages slowly. Her father watched her. She reached the last entry. Dated the week before, Marcus W. 6th grade. Referred from a neighboring school by Mrs. Patterson, fractions. Starts Thursday. She closed the notebook, looked at her father. Walt explained. Back in 2005, a boy named Jerome had stayed behind in the hallway after school, crying, because he couldn't read the note his teacher had sent home for his parents. Walt took him to the only place where nobody would interrupt them, the boiler room in the basement, quiet, warm in winter, and completely ignored by everyone in the building. He spent an hour with Jerome. 2 weeks later, Jerome could read the note. 3 months later, he was at grade level. Word spread the way things spread among kids. Quietly, person to person, year after year. No announcement, no sign on the door. Walt never asked for permission, because he knew if he did, someone would find a reason to say no, so he just showed up. Every day after his official shift ended, 5 o'clock to 6:30, in the boiler room, with a small whiteboard he'd bought at Walmart for $11 in 2006. Still hanging on the concrete wall between 2 heating pipes. 19 years, over 200 kids, 23 in college, All of it in secret. All of it for free. All of it dismantled on a Tuesday morning in November in 9 minutes and 37 seconds. Patrice sat quietly for a long time after her father finished talking. Then she said something Walt didn't see coming. "Dad, you have the notebook. You have the names. Do you know where they are now?" "Some of them," he said. "Most of them." "And the school board meeting for the district?" "Do you know when it is?" Walt frowned. "Third Thursday of every month," he said. He knew because for years he'd cleaned the meeting room and set up the chairs before the board members arrived. Patrice opened her laptop on the kitchen table. "Next meeting is in 18 days, she said. "And any citizen of Des Moines can sign up to speak. 3 minutes of public comment." She looked at her father. "But you're not going up there alone." Walt looked at the notebook, at the names, at the dates, at the 23 lines that said went to college. He hadn't planned any of this. He'd never wanted recognition, never asked for anything beyond the paycheck that was rightfully his. But sitting at that table, looking at the notebook he'd carried for 19 years without showing it to a single soul, Walter Grimes made a quiet decision. If Rebecca Halston wanted metrics, he had metrics. The difference was hers were on paper. His had names, last names, and email addresses. Patrice Grimes was an HR coordinator at a logistics company in Des Moines. Finding people was part of what she did. That same night, she opened her father's notebook to page 1 and got to work. LinkedIn, Facebook, public school district records, high school graduation lists available online. In 3 hours, she'd tracked down 18 of the 23 names marked with "went to college." She didn't send a generic message. For each one, she wrote carefully, the kind of message you write when what you're saying actually matters. She explained who she was. She explained what had happened. And she asked one simple question. "Do you remember Mr. Walt?" The responses started coming in before midnight. The first was from Jerome Archer, 28 years old, now a high school teacher in Ames, Iowa. He responded in 6 minutes. 2 lines. "Of course, I remember him. What do you need me to do?" By the next morning, 15 people had replied. Every single one of them with some version of the same message. Every single one of them wanting to do something. Walt didn't know any of this yet. That night, he slept with the notebook on his nightstand, for the first time outside the drawer where it had lived for 19 years. Patrice ran the next 18 days like a project. First, she reached out to Mrs. Dorothy Patterson, the 3rd-grade teacher who had quietly referred kids to Walt for over a decade. Mrs. Patterson was 67 years old, retired for 2 years, and picked up the phone on the second ring. When Patrice finished explaining, Mrs. Patterson went quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I have emails. Years of emails where I reported Walt's program to the previous administration and asked them to make it official. I never got a single response, but the emails exist." Second, Patrice consulted a labor and education attorney, not to sue. Not yet. Just to understand the rules around the public board meeting, what could be presented, how the process worked. The attorney confirmed any citizen could speak. Documents could be submitted as public record. And board members were legally required to formally respond to complaints raised in public session within 30 days. Third, and this was the part that took the most care, Patrice called each of the 15 former students who had responded and asked them one direct question. "Would you be willing to show up in person?" 14 said yes. 3rd Thursday of November, Des Moines School District Meeting Room. 7 p.m. These meetings typically drew between 12 and 20 people. District staff, a few parents, the occasional local reporter. That Thursday, when board president Dr. Alan Purcell walked into the room, there were 67 people seated and another 20 standing in the back. He looked around the room, then down at the public comment sign-up sheet. 15 names. First on the list, Walter Grimes. Rebecca Halston was sitting in the second row with her assistant beside her. She'd been notified of the meeting as standard protocol. She hadn't given it much thought. Walt stood when his name was called. Navy blue suit, the same one he'd worn to his wife's funeral 8 years before. Patrice had pressed it that morning without being asked. He walked to the microphone, placed the black notebook on the table in front of him. He spoke for exactly 3 minutes. No drama, no direct accusations, just facts. 19 years of service. A termination carried out without adequate notice, in public, in front of students. And a voluntary unpaid tutoring program that had operated inside the building for 19 years with the indirect knowledge of the previous administration documented in archived emails and had sent 23 students to college. He opened the notebook to the first page and handed it to the board secretary as a matter of public record. Then he walked back to his seat. Board President Purcell looked at the notebook, then at the room, then at the list. Next speaker, Jerome Archer. Jerome stood up. Teacher, son of a single mother. Had arrived at Garfield Elementary in 3rd grade unable to read a note sent home by his teacher. He spoke for 2 minutes. Steady voice, eyes wet at the end. After him, Destiny Monroe, registered nurse, University of Iowa 2019. After her, Calvin Reese, software engineer, first person in his family to graduate from college. One by one, 14 people, 14 stories that all started in the same place, a boiler room, an $11 whiteboard, and a man who showed up before sunrise every single day because he figured it was the least he could do. Rebecca Halston didn't leave the room, but at some point during the testimonies, Patrice glanced over at her and saw something she hadn't expected to see. Rebecca was looking at her hands, not at the board, not at the speakers, at her own hands. Board President Dr. Alan Purcell, 54 years old, listened to all 14 testimonies without interrupting a single one. When the last speaker finished, he called for a 15-minute recess. During the break, he walked over to where Walt was sitting. No aides, no cameras. He crouched slightly to be at eye level and said something quietly. Walt went completely still. The two men held each other's gaze for a few seconds without speaking. What Alan Purcell had said was simple. I was a student at Garfield Elementary. My family moved to Des Moines in 1981. I was the new kid, didn't know anyone, and I struggled with math. One of the teachers referred me to a staff member who helped kids after hours. He paused. That wasn't you, but I know exactly who you are, Mr. Grimes, and I know what that boiler room means. Walt didn't say a word. Purcell went back to the board table, and the 15-minute recess lasted 22. The session reopened at 8:04 p.m. Board President Purcell asked Dr. Rebecca Halston to approach the microphone to respond to the concerns raised during public comment. Standard protocol, right of reply. Rebecca stood, straightened her jacket, walked to the microphone with the posture of someone who had been trained for difficult rooms. She explained that the decision had been part of a legitimate operational review process, that the district had hiring and staffing protocols, that unauthorized activities on school grounds, regardless of intent, represented a legal liability for the school, that she regretted if the manner in which the communication had been delivered caused any distress, but that the decision itself was defensible. It was a competent response, well-structured, almost convincing. Then board member Miriam Okafor raised her hand. 22 years as a public school teacher before moving into district administration. She didn't waste words. Dr. Halston, you've stated that unauthorized activities represent a legal liability, correct? Correct. Then explain to me why the emails from Mrs. Patterson sent to the previous administration in 2017, 2018, 2019, and 2021 requesting that this program be officially recognized were never responded to. Because if the district had responded, even to say no, we'd have documentation showing the program was addressed. But there's no response. What there is 7 years of administrative silence. Rebecca opened her mouth, closed it. That would be a matter for the previous administration, she said finally. You are correct, Miriam replied, but the termination is a matter for the current one, and it was you who carried it out. 4 full seconds of silence in that room. Purcell wrote something on the notepad in front of him. The board didn't issue a ruling that night. That wasn't protocol. But the following morning, Walt received a call from the district's legal department, and 3 days after that, a formal letter. The letter stated 3 things. First, the termination of Walter Grimes had been executed without the minimum advance notice required under the district employees' collective bargaining agreement, 30 days or equivalent compensation. The district acknowledged the procedural error and offered full retroactive compensation. Second, the district had initiated an internal review of the operational restructuring process conducted by Dr. Halston, which had resulted in 5 terminations in total. All 5 were employees with more than 10 years of service. None had received adequate advance notice. The review was being conducted by the district's compliance department with external oversight. Third, and this is where Patrice, who was reading the letter alongside her father, stopped and read it twice to make sure she'd gotten it right. The district was creating a new position, Community Learning Coordinator, with a dedicated room, an annual materials budget, responsibility for structuring and expanding voluntary tutoring programs in partnership with the surrounding community. Salary 23% above his previous rate. The position had been created specifically to be offered to Walter Grimes as first choice. He had 10 days to respond. Walt read the letter all the way through, folded it carefully, set it on the kitchen table next to the black notebook. He was quiet for a moment. "I'll take it," he said. "But I want one thing in the contract." "What?" Patrice asked. "That the program stays in the same place." He paused. "The kids already know where it is. Dr. Alma." Rebecca Halston was reassigned to an administrative role with no staff management responsibilities at the district's central office in January of 2025. No formal termination, no public proceedings, just a quiet transfer that everyone understood for exactly what it was. The Des Moines Register ran a story in December of 2024. The headline read, "The Boiler Room Teacher, How a Janitor Built a College Pipeline Nobody Knew About." The story was shared 14,000 times in the first 48 hours. A TV station out of Chicago reached out requesting an interview. Walt declined, politely. Jerome Archer, the first student, now a teacher in Ames, came back to Garfield Elementary in February of 2025 as a weekly volunteer in the program. The $11 whiteboard was still on the wall of the boiler room. Walt left it there. In his first week as Community Learning Coordinator, he opened the notebook to a fresh page, wrote the date and the first name. Amara J. 4th grade, math. She cried when I left. First session, Monday.
Walt Grimes never wanted to be a hero. He wanted kids to be able to read the note their teacher sent home, to pass the test, to have a shot that the system wasn't giving them. And for 19 years, he did that in complete silence. No camera, no recognition, nothing in return. The lesson Walt leaves us isn't about revenge. It's about this. When you build something real, something true, nobody can erase it. They can take your keys, they can walk you out the door, they can eliminate your position on a piece of paper, but they cannot eliminate 23 names in a black notebook. They cannot eliminate Jerome, who became a teacher, or Destiny, who became a nurse, or Amara, who was crying in the hallway. Has there ever been someone in your life who did for you what nobody else saw? A teacher, a neighbor, someone who wasn't even supposed to stop, but did? Think about that person right now. Because the next story is about someone who was also invisible for years. Except what he found in his company's spreadsheets was something the people in charge never wanted anyone to see. And when they fired him to shut him up, he'd already made a copy of everything. Don't go anywhere. I need you to think about something for a second. You're sitting at your desk, you're doing your job, the exact job they hired you to do, and you find something, a number that doesn't add up, then another one, then another. You're not looking for trouble. You're not trying to be anybody's hero. You're just doing your job. So you do what any honest person would do. You send an internal email. You flag the discrepancy. You trust the system. 4 days later, they walk you out of the building. Damon Bridges didn't go looking for a fight. The fight found him. And when it did, he realized he'd been quietly collecting the evidence for years without even knowing it. This is his story.
The audit.
Damon Bridges was 41 years old and had spent the last 9 of them as a senior HR analyst at Meridian Coastal Group, a financial services company based in Savannah, Georgia. 340 employees. An impeccable reputation as an, quote, inclusive and progressive workplace. They'd won a diversity award in 2021. They had an entire page on their website dedicated to pay equity. They had a DE committee that met every first Tuesday of the month and produced reports that went into a folder on the company server that nobody ever opened. Damon knew that because he was the one who maintained the folder. He hadn't come to Meridian with big ambitions. Business degree from Georgia Southern. A partially completed master's in people management he'd put on hold when his second kid was born. And a reputation for being the kind of professional who solved problems before anyone realized they were problems. His direct supervisor, VP of People James Whitfield, used to say Damon was the glue that held the department together. Damon used to think that was a compliment. Later, he understood exactly what it meant. Glue doesn't get credit. Glue doesn't get a name. Glue only matters when something breaks. At home, his wife Renata, a high school teacher, 2 kids, Noah, 11, and Chloe, 8. They'd bought the house 2 years earlier. 30-year mortgage. Renata had gone back to full-time work when their youngest started school. For the first time in their adult lives, things felt stable. September 2024. Everything was fine. Until the annual compensation spreadsheet landed on his screen. Every September, Damon received the same routine assignment: consolidate compensation data across all departments for the annual internal audit report. Salaries, bonuses, promotions, pay bands by job title, tedious work, necessary work. That September, something caught his eye in a column he'd looked at dozens of times before. Senior financial analysts, same title, same level, same experience requirements listed in the job description. The salary gap between the 12 professionals in that band was up to $18,400 a year. Damon did what any HR analyst would do. He looked for the variable. Tenure? Didn't explain it? 2 of the lowest paid employees had more years with the company than 3 of the highest paid. Performance? All reviews fell in the exceeds expectations or meets expectations range. Location? Everyone in the same Savannah office. He expanded the analysis. Other titles, other departments. The pattern showed up in 23 minutes. It wasn't random. It wasn't a statistical anomaly. It was systematic, consistent, spanning at least 7 years of data he had access to. Black employees and women in roles equivalent to their white and male colleagues were earning, on average, 14.3% less. In some specific job titles, the gap reached 22%. Damon sat in front of that screen for a moment. Then he did something that, in hindsight, was simultaneously the most honest and the most naive thing he could have done. He forwarded the analysis to James Whitfield by internal email. Subject line: compensation band inconsistencies. Need context before I close out the report. Sent at 2:37 p.m. on a Thursday. Whitfield replied at 4:52 p.m. Thanks for flagging. Let me loop in the CFO and get back to you. Damon closed his laptop and went to pick up his kids from school. 4 days later, Monday morning, 9:15 a.m., James Whitfield appeared in his doorway with the Director of Corporate Security standing right beside him. Damon, we need to talk about your position with the company. The meeting lasted 11 minutes. Departmental restructuring, position elimination, a 60-day severance package, and a confidentiality agreement to sign before he left. Whitfield laid it all out in a beige folder, company logo in the upper right corner, with the clinical efficiency of someone who had rehearsed every single word. You've been an exemplary professional, Damon. This is in no way a reflection of your work. Damon looked at the folder, then at Whitfield. James, I sent that email on Thursday. This has no relation to that. Whitfield said. No hesitation, no blinking. 5 years working together, Damon said slowly. And you can't look me in the eye. Whitfield looked at the window. Damon did not sign the confidentiality agreement. He took the folder, thanked them, and walked out. The security director followed him to his desk to collect his badge and his company laptop. Damon handed over the laptop without a word. But the company laptop didn't have the files that mattered, because Damon, out of 9 years of professional habit, always kept working copies of compensation reports in his personal email. So he could work from home on weekends when deadlines were tight. 7 years of Meridian Coastal Group compensation data, sitting in Damon Bridges' personal Gmail account, completely legal to have there, because his contract had never included a clause restricting personal copies of work documents, a detail that CFO Carl Weston had forgotten to check before he signed the termination order. Damon got home at 11:23 on a Monday morning. Renata was at school. Noah and Chloe were in class. The house was quiet in that specific way it gets when it's supposed to be empty. But it isn't. He sat down at the small desk he'd set up in the guest room when they bought the house. Simple setup. 2 monitors. A bookshelf with the textbooks from the master's degree he'd never finished. He opened his personal Gmail. The files were all there, every single one, organized by year, by department, by quarter. Because that's how he worked. Methodical, thorough, invisible. He opened the 2024 spreadsheet and stared at the numbers for a long time. Then he opened 2023, 2022, 2021, 2020. The pattern hadn't started with the current leadership. It went back to 2017, the earliest year he had data for, which meant it predated Whitfield. It predated the current CFO. It was structural, deliberate, institutional. Damon closed the laptop, went to the kitchen, made coffee, stood at the window looking out at the backyard where Noah had left his bike lying in the grass since Saturday. Renata came home at 3:40, an hour earlier than usual. She'd asked to leave early when he texted saying he needed to talk. She came in through the back door, took one look at his face, and didn't ask a single question. She sat down across from him and waited. Damon told her everything. When he finished, Renata was quiet for a moment. Then she asked the only question that mattered. Did you sign the confidentiality agreement? No. She nodded slowly. Then you still have a choice. That night, after the kids were in bed, Damon and Renata sat in the home office with both monitors open. Damon started building what he called, to himself, the real report. Not the internal audit he'd been hired to produce. The report that Meridian Coastal Group had spent 7 years making sure nobody would ever put together. He had the compensation data. But now he needed the legal context. 2 hours of research. Here's what he found. The Federal Equal Pay Act had prohibited wage discrimination based on gender since 1963. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act prohibited discrimination based on race. And most importantly for his specific situation, the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, had a complaint process that anyone could initiate, former employee or not. And there was one detail he found buried in a footnote of a legal journal article that stopped him cold. When a company terminates an employee within a suspicious window after an internal complaint, specifically less than 90 days, that constitutes potential retaliation. And retaliation in wage discrimination cases was treated by the EEOC as a separate and additional violation. 4 days between the email and the termination. Damon wrote that down on a yellow notepad, underlined it twice. Then he pulled up a list of labor and discrimination attorneys in Savannah and Atlanta. It was 11 at night. He sent emails to 6 of them with the exact same subject line. Potential systemic wage discrimination case, 7 years of data, seeking initial consultation. 3 responded before midnight. The attorney Damon chose was Serena Okafor, 46 years old, office in Atlanta with a satellite location in Savannah, federal labor law specialist with a focus on institutional discrimination cases, 12-year track record that included 2 settlements with Fortune 500 companies that had never made the news, because the company's confidentiality clauses covered the corporations, not the plaintiffs. She took Damon's video call the next morning. He shared his screen, walked her through the spreadsheets, explained the methodology, described the internal email, Whitfield's response, and the termination 4 days later. Serena was quiet for 40 seconds after he finished. Damon had already learned that experienced attorneys don't fill silence out of reflex. "Mr. Bridges," she said finally, "how many employees are covered by this data?" 340 total, but the ones affected by the pattern I identified are approximately 127 at the Savannah headquarters. And you mentioned the company is part of a larger corporate group. Yes. Meridian Coastal Group has 3 subsidiaries. I only have access to the parent company's data, but the HR structure is centralized across the entire group. Serena made a note. If the compensation structure is centralized and the pattern is consistent across 7 years, it's reasonable to assume the subsidiaries follow the same model. She paused. Which means the actual number of affected employees could be considerably larger than 127. Damon hadn't thought about that. Serena continued, "I'll be direct with you. This case has 2 distinct components. The first is your individual retaliation claim, which is strong, documented, and relatively straightforward. The second is potentially much larger and requires a different strategy." "What strategy?" "A formal EEOC complaint requesting a systemic investigation." She paused again. "And there's an additional mechanism you may not be aware of. Depending on how the investigation develops, there may be grounds under the False Claims Act if the company held federal contracts during the period of discrimination." Damon went still. "Meridian has financial services contracts with 2 federal agencies," he said slowly. "I used to process the payments for those contracts." The silence this time was Damon's. Serena let him sit with it. "That changes the case," he said finally. "Considerably," she confirmed. Serena laid out the strategy in detail at their next meeting. Step 1. A formal EEOC complaint with all of Damon's documentation, the spreadsheets, the methodology, the internal email, Whitfield's confirmation of receipt, and the termination record 4 days later. This opened the official investigation and legally protected Damon from any attempt by Meridian to claim improper use of data. Step 2. And this is what Serena called the double weapon, Meridian Coastal Group's own internal compliance hotline. Every company with more than 50 employees was federally required to maintain an anonymous internal reporting channel. Meridian used a third-party system called Ethics Point, standard across the industry. "Do you still have access to that hotline number?" Serena asked. "It's in the employee handbook," Damon said. "Which I still have." "Perfect." Serena explained, "When a complaint is filed through a compliance hotline, the company is required by its own protocols to log it, investigate it, and document the response. All of that goes into a file the EEOC can subpoena during the investigation. If the company ignores the internal complaint, which is the most likely response, that becomes additional evidence of institutional bad faith. If they investigate internally and find the problem, they'll want to settle before the EEOC gets there, which accelerates everything. It's a trap, Damon said. It's a mirror, Serena corrected. The company built the system. We're just going to use it. Damon filed the anonymous complaint through the Ethics Point hotline that night. He described the compensation pattern with enough technical precision to be verifiable, but without revealing that the person filing had access to 7 years of internal spreadsheets. The complaint was submitted at 9:47 p.m. At 9:03 the following morning, the system generated an automatic confirmation with a case number. Damon took a screenshot, forwarded it to Serena. She replied in 2 minutes. Perfect. Now we wait. Damon Bridges was not the kind of man who waited passively. While the EEOC processed the formal complaint, which would take weeks, he kept working. Not for Meridian, for the case. Every morning after Noah and Chloe left for school, he'd sit down at the guest room desk and build what Serena had called the support dossier. Every affected job title, every year, every percentage point, comparative tables, trend charts, statistical analysis using the exact same methodology the EEOC used in its own investigations. He downloaded the agency's technical manual from their public website and read every single page. Renata would find him there at 11 o'clock at night. She never said anything. She'd set a glass of water on the desk and go back to bed. In the 3rd week, Serena called with an update. The EEOC has accepted the complaint and opened a formal investigation. That means they'll be requesting documentation directly from Meridian. She paused. And there's something else. My team ran a public records search on the group's subsidiaries. And? All 3 subsidiaries share the centralized HR structure in Savannah, just like you suspected. And all 3 have held federal contracts in the past 7 years. A pause. Damon, if the pattern holds across the subsidiaries, we're looking at a much larger exposure than the original case. How many employees total? The group has approximately 847 employees across all 4 entities. Damon went quiet. 847 people, 7 years, 14.3% average gap. He ran the math in his head. Then on paper, because he didn't want to believe the number he'd calculated mentally. The cumulative difference in unpaid wages over 7 years across 847 employees was in the range of tens of millions of dollars. Serena, he said slowly, the False Claims Act. If we confirm the company held federal contracts throughout the entire documented period of discrimination, then the Department of Justice can open a parallel investigation, she confirmed. And under the False Claims Act, the whistleblower who originated the complaint is entitled to between 15 and 30% of the amount recovered by the federal government. The silence this time lasted longer. I didn't do this for the money, Damon said. I know, Serena replied, but the money comes either way. Adjuta Carl Weston was 54 years old, had been CFO of Meridian Coastal Group for 11 years, and had built his entire career on the premise that the numbers that mattered were the ones that showed up in the reports he approved. The other numbers, the ones in the compensation spreadsheets he had personally adjusted by job title and demographic profile over the course of a decade, always within margins the legal department had described as defensible in individual litigation. Those numbers existed in a different category in his mind. Not injustice, cost management. He'd slept fine for 11 years with that distinction. The first sign that something had shifted was a formal letter from the EEOC arriving at the company's legal office in the 5th week after Damon's termination. A request for compensation documentation covering all employees across all group entities for the past 7 years. The corporate attorney, Frederick Hale, An Atlanta firm billing at $380 an hour called Carl that afternoon. "Carl, we have a situation. How much time do we have to respond?" 30 days for the initial documentation. But Frederick paused. "There's something else. We received a notification from Ethics Point. A complaint was filed through our own internal compliance hotline 6 weeks ago." Carl went quiet. 6 weeks, he repeated. 2 days after Bridges' termination. The math was simple. Carl did it in under 3 seconds. What does the complaint say? Frederick read through the key points. Compensation pattern. Demographic disparity. 7-year period. "It's too detailed to be accidentally anonymous," Frederick said. "Whoever filed this had access to granular internal data, and they filed before the formal EEOC complaint, which means it's going to appear as evidence that the company was notified internally and took no action." Carl Weston stared out the window at the port of Savannah for a long moment. 11 years of carefully managed numbers, and a 41-year-old HR analyst had dismantled all of it in 6 weeks without making a single sound. "Frederick," he said finally, "what's our maximum exposure?" Frederick took a moment before answering. "If the subsidiaries follow the same pattern, and the DOJ comes in under the False Claims Act?" He paused. "Somewhere between $40 and $60 million, depending on how retroactive damages are calculated." The silence this time was Carl's. The EEOC completed its preliminary review of Meridian's documentation in 8 weeks. What they found confirmed everything Damon had identified, and then went further. The wage discrimination pattern was present across all 4 entities in the group. 847 affected employees. Average disparity of 14.7% by gender and 13.9% by race in equivalent roles. Confirmed period, 7 continuous years. The agency issued a finding of probable cause. The technical language meaning there was sufficient evidence of violation to proceed with formal action. At the same time, the internal Ethics Point complaint had been formally ignored by Meridian for the 6 weeks between its filing and the arrival of the EEOC notification. 0 documented action. 0 response to the case number generated by the system. Serena presented that to the EEOC as supplemental evidence of institutional bad faith. The agency agreed. The following week, the Department of Justice opened a parallel investigation under the False Claims Act. 3 active federal contracts had been maintained by Meridian throughout the entire documented period of discrimination. Frederick Hale called Carl Weston with the update on a Friday at 5:47 p.m. Carl listened without saying a word. When Frederick finished, Carl asked one question. "How long before this goes public? If it goes to litigation, we don't control the timing. If we want a settlement, we need to initiate contact with the EEOC within the next 2 weeks." Frederick paused. "Carl, I need to be straight with you. This company's defense position is extremely weak. The data is the data. The ignored internal complaint is documented. The retaliation against Bridges is chronologically obvious, and the DOJ at the table changes everything. What's your recommendation?" "Settlement, as fast as possible, before the DOJ formalizes the charges and the number moves completely out of our control." Carl looked out at the port, the same port he'd been staring at for weeks. This time, he didn't speak for a long time. Then, "Start the conversations." The settlement negotiations between Meridian Coastal Group and the EEOC lasted 11 weeks. Damon found out the talks had started through Serena, who had been formally notified as the representative of the original whistleblower. He was in the guest room office when she called. Noah was out in the backyard. Chloe was drawing at the kitchen table. Renata was grading papers on the couch. A regular Tuesday. "They want to settle," Serena said. which means they know they'd lose. How long? Depends on the EEOC and the DOJ, but my estimate is 8 to 12 weeks for a preliminary agreement. Damon had spent the past several weeks sending out resumes. He'd received 2 offers, one in Atlanta, one in Charlotte. He'd turned both down. Not because he didn't need the income. The mortgage was real. The kids were real. The grocery bill was real. But there was something he needed to see through to the end before he started anything else. Renata had agreed without needing much of an explanation. She knew her husband. She knew he wasn't the kind of man who left wrong numbers in a report. During the weeks of negotiation, Damon kept refining the dossier. Not because Serena needed it, she had more than enough, but because it was the only way he knew how to process what was happening. Turn injustice into data, give precision to what had been deliberately obscured. One evening, Noah came into the office while he was working. "Dad, are you going to win?" Damon looked at his son. "It's not exactly a competition," he said. "But are you right?" "Yes." "Then you're going to win," Noah said, and walked back to his room with the absolute certainty of an 11-year-old. Damon stared at the doorway for a moment, then turned back to the spreadsheet. The settlement was finalized on a Wednesday in February of 2025. Serena called at 2:22 p.m. Damon was in the backyard fixing Chloe's bike. The derailleur had broken the week before. He answered with grease on his hand. "It's done," she said. The total settlement was $4.1 million, directed to the 847 affected employees, calculated based on accumulated wage disparity by job title, tenure, and documented period of discrimination. The EEOC would oversee the distribution directly, so no individual employee would need to file a separate claim. Meridian Coastal Group was required to bring in an external compliance monitor for 3 years to revise the entire compensation structure with independent semi-annual audits, and to implement a pay transparency program that had to be approved by the EEOC before it could go live. The DOJ closed the False Claims Act investigation with a separate agreement. $890,000 in penalties for the period during which the company had maintained federal contracts while practicing documented discrimination. Under the False Claims Act, Damon Bridges, as the whistleblower who had originated the chain of complaints, was entitled to 22% of the amount recovered by the federal government, $195,800, deposited directly into the Bridges family account in March of 2025. Plus, as part of the individual settlement for the retaliation claim, the termination carried out 4 days after a documented internal complaint, Meridian paid Damon separately $114,000 in damages and back pay. No formal admission of wrongdoing. But, at Serena's insistence, and Damon's, no confidentiality clause either. Total received by Damon Bridges, $309,800. He stood in the backyard with the phone in his hand for a long moment after Serena hung up. Chloe appeared at the back door. "Dad, did you fix my bike?" "Almost," he said. 5 more minutes. He went back to the bike, finished the derailleur, tested every gear. Called Chloe over. Only after she rode off across the backyard did he sit down on the back steps and stay quiet for a stretch of time he couldn't measure afterward. Carl Weston, CFO of Meridian Coastal Group, submitted his voluntary resignation 3 weeks before the settlement was finalized. The internal announcement said he was leaving to pursue new opportunities. Nobody in the Savannah market called him about new opportunities in the months that followed. James Whitfield, VP of People, the man who had replied to Damon's email with "Let me loop in the CFO and get back to you," and 48 hours later had signed the termination order, was kept on at the company as part of an internal arrangement. But the mandatory compliance restructuring removed him from any role involving staff management or access to compensation data. The page on Meridian's website about pay equity and commitment to diversity was taken down during the negotiations. It never came back in the same form. The 2021 Diversity Award stayed on the wall in the lobby for a few months longer. Then it disappeared too. Damon received 3 formal job offers during the negotiation period, all from organizations that had been following the case through legal industry channels. He chose the one that paid the least of the 3, a Savannah-based nonprofit specializing in pay equity auditing for mid-size companies. The salary was 31% below what he'd been making at Meridian. He accepted without negotiating. Renata found out the number when he came home with the offer letter. She was quiet for a moment. "It's what you want to do," she said. "Not a question." "It's what I know how to do," he replied. "And this time, for the right people." Renata took the letter, read it, folded it, handed it back. "The boys need dinner," she said, and went to the kitchen. Damon stood in the hallway smiling to himself for a few seconds, then went to wash his hands and help set the table. In April of 2025, Serena Okafor sent Damon a screenshot. It was a post on a professional network. A former employee of one of Meridian's subsidiaries in Charleston had written, "I received a deposit today from my former employer, covering wage differences going back 6 years. I didn't know this had been happening to me. I don't know who filed the complaint. But thank you. You changed something real in my life." The post had 847 likes. Damon didn't comment, didn't share it. He saved the image to the same folder where he kept the case files, and went to his first day at the new job.
Damon Bridges wasn't an investigator. He wasn't an activist. He was an HR analyst who did his job right and found what he found because he was paying attention when most people weren't. They tried to silence him with a beige folder, a handshake, and 60 days of pay, and he just didn't sign. That's the part that stays with me, the confidentiality agreement. Because how many people sign without reading? How many people take what's offered because they're scared, because they have a mortgage, because they have kids, because they think they don't have a choice? Damon had all of that. The mortgage was real, the kids were real, the fear was real. But he didn't sign, and 847 people got back what was theirs. The lesson here isn't about money. It's about this. When you find something wrong and you're the only person in the room who knows, what do you do with that moment? Damon knew what to do. The next story is different. It doesn't happen in an office. It doesn't happen in a boardroom. It happens on 180 acres of Nebraska farmland that June Hartwell's family had worked for 3 generations, until a corporation from Dallas decided that what was underneath that land was worth a whole lot more than her entire life. What they didn't know is that June photographed birds, and on an old camera sitting in a kitchen drawer, there was a photo taken on the exact day they claimed she'd done something she never did. The third story starts right now. Don't go anywhere. I want you to picture something. A piece of land your grandfather cleared with his own hands, where your father learned to walk, where you buried your husband on a Tuesday afternoon in October with nothing but the wind and the open fields as witness. 180 acres, 3 generations, 87 years of the same family working the same soil. Now, picture a man in a suit sitting across from you at your kitchen table, the same table your grandmother bought at a store that doesn't even exist anymore, telling you that you violated an environmental regulation, that there's a legal process underway, that it might just be better for everyone if you went ahead and signed. June Hartwell didn't sign. And what she found on an old camera sitting in a kitchen drawer didn't just save her farm. It changed everything those men thought they owned.
The last field.
June Hartwell was 62 years old. and had been born in the same bedroom where her mother had been born before her. The Hartwell farm sat 23 miles northwest of Omaha, Nebraska. 180 acres of flat land that June's grandfather, Edmund Hartwell, had bought in 1937 for $4,200 in cash. Money he'd saved over 11 years working on a railroad. Edmund planted wheat the first year, added soybeans the second, and in the third year built the barn that was still standing. Renovated 3 times, but on the same foundation from 1939. June's father Robert took over the farm in 1971. June grew up between the fields, learned to drive a tractor at 14, and studied agronomy at the University of Nebraska, with the clarity of someone who already knew exactly where she was going after graduation. She went back in 1985, married Thomas Hartwell. In 1988, distant cousin, same last name already in the family, a running joke in Omaha for years. Thomas died of a sudden heart attack one October in 2019, alone in the south field, work boots muddy, hands still on the fence post he'd been repairing. June found him at dusk. Since then, she'd run the farm with 2 seasonal workers and the occasional help of her oldest son, Patrick, who lived in Lincoln and came out on weekends when he could. It wasn't the most efficient operation in the county, but it was hers. It was real. And every morning when she opened the back door and saw the fields in the first light, she felt the weight of 3 generations on her own shoulders, not as a burden, as belonging. In August of 2024, a man in a suit appeared at the farm entrance with a business card and a practiced smile. The card read, Agricor Holdings, Rural Asset Development. Agricor Holdings was an agribusiness corporation headquartered in Dallas, Texas, with operations across 11 Midwestern states. The business model was simple and had been executed with surgical precision dozens of times before. Identify rural properties with appreciation potential. Acquire them below market value through financial pressure. Consolidate them into large-scale operations. Sell or lease to agricultural investment funds. The man who showed up at June's gate was named Brett Callahan, 34 years old. Well-cut hair, firm handshake, the kind of person who had learned to appear trustworthy as a professional skill. He made an offer for the Hartwell farm, $2.1 million. The county's estimated market value was $2.4 million. The $300,000 gap was presented as, quote, a discount for process efficiency. June poured him coffee, listened to everything he had to say, thanked him for his time. It's not for sale, she said. Brett came back in September. Revised offer, $2.25 million. Same answer. Then in October, something different happened. June received a formal notice from the Nebraska Department of Natural Resources. The notice alleged that the Hartwell farm had violated Regulation 14C of the State Environmental Code, unauthorized use of a Class II pesticide in a watershed protection area, on a specific date, September 14th, 2024. The initial penalty, $47,000. And a note at the bottom of the notice, written in careful bureaucratic language, stating that documented environmental violations could result in operational restrictions and, in serious cases, eminent domain proceedings in the public interest. June read the notice 3 times. Then she walked over to the calendar on the kitchen wall and looked at September 14th, 2024. In the small, precise handwriting she'd used for that calendar since 1991, she had written a single word on that date: birds. Thomas had given June a camera for Christmas in 2003, a film camera at first, replaced by a digital one in 2011. And every Saturday since then, when the weather held, June walked the fields with that camera and photographed migratory birds, It wasn't a professional hobby. She never posted the photos anywhere. It was simply something she did. A way of walking the land without the weight of work attached to it. Thomas had started joining her in his last few years. After he died, she kept going alone. The digital camera automatically embedded in every single photo. The date, the time, and the GPS coordinates. On September 14, 2024, the day the notice claimed she had applied unauthorized pesticide in the south field, June had gone out at 7:12 in the morning with her camera. She'd walked to the north field, then along the East Creek bank, then up to the highest point on the property, where a lone oak tree stood that birds used as a resting post. She had taken 34 photos that day, the last one at 4:47 in the afternoon. Every single one with GPS coordinates, every single one with a timestamp. Not one of them in the south field, because she had deliberately avoided the south field that Saturday. The irrigation equipment was being serviced and the ground was muddy. She had not left the property at any point during the day, and there was no Class 2 pesticide in any storage unit on the Hartwell farm. She had switched entirely to integrated pest management in 2019, a decision documented in a report she had submitted to the very same Department of Natural Resources that had just sent her the notice. Someone had inserted a violation that never happened into a state regulatory system, and that someone had picked the wrong day. June wasn't the kind of woman who called her son in a panic. Patrick Hartwell, 38 years old, civil engineer in Lincoln, had grown up watching his mother handle problems with the same calm precision she applied to everything. A crop lost to hail, the death of his father. June processed first, reacted second, and by the time she reacted, she already knew exactly what needed to happen. So when she called on a Monday evening with the Department of Natural Resources notice in her hand, Patrick knew from her tone, not from what she was saying, that something different was going on. She walked him through all of it, the Agricor offer in August, the second offer in September, the notice that arrived 3 weeks later, the date, September 14th, the calendar, the birds, the camera. Patrick listened without interrupting once. "Mom," he said when she finished, "are the photos still on the camera?" "On the computer, too. I've done automatic backup every Sunday since 2015. All of them with GPS and timestamp? All of them." Patrick was quiet for a moment. "Don't respond to the notice yet. Don't pay anything. Don't sign anything." A pause. "I'll be there first thing tomorrow." He arrived at 7:30 in the morning, brought his laptop, brought coffee from a bakery in Lincoln, because he knew his mother would already have coffee made. But that bakery coffee was the kind of small comfort she never bought for herself. They sat at the kitchen table, the same one that had been there since his grandmother, and opened the photos. 34 images. North Field, East Creek Bank, the lone oak, a red-tailed hawk perched on the highest branch at 2:23 in the afternoon. GPS coordinates on every single file, placing June 1st, 4 miles from the south field where the violation had allegedly occurred. Patrick exported the metadata from every photo into a spreadsheet, organized by time, plotted the coordinates on a property map he'd drawn himself years earlier for a drainage project. The story of September 14th told by that data was completely different from the one in the notice. "This is alibi evidence," Patrick said. "I know," June replied. "The question is, who inserted the violation into the department's system, and why they picked that specific date?" Patrick looked at his mother. "You think it was Agricor?" "Not a question. I think someone picked a random Saturday in September, without knowing I've gone out with that camera every single Saturday for 21 years, June said. "And they made the mistake of picking a Saturday," Patrick spent the afternoon doing research. Not on Agricor. That would come later. First, he wanted to understand why this specific farm. The offer had been $2.25 million on the second attempt. Comparable land in the county was trading between $1.8 and $2.6 million, depending on soil quality and location. Agricor's offer was within market range, so why the effort? Why a fraudulent regulatory notice if the offer was already reasonable? He started with public geological records from Douglas County and the surrounding counties, drilling data, hydrological surveys, reports from the Nebraska Department of Environment and Energy available on the state's public portal. It took 2 hours to find the document that changed everything. It was a hydrological study conducted in 2021 by an environmental consulting firm called Meridian Water Solutions, no relation to the Meridian Coastal in Savannah, commissioned by the state of Nebraska to map underground aquifers in the greater Omaha region. The study had identified a significant aquifer formation in the subsurface of the area. The highest concentration sat within a band of approximately 340 acres crossing 3 rural properties. One of them was the Hartwell Farm, 180 acres sitting directly over the point of greatest concentration. Patrick read the study twice, then looked for cross-references, found one. A Nebraska Department of Water Resources internal report from 2023, classified as restricted use but available through a public records request that someone had already made. The document was archived on a government transparency website. The report described the aquifer as of strategic regional importance and estimated sustainable extraction capacity at volumes sufficient to supply a city of 40,000 people for decades. The water was the asset, not the land. The land was just the way to get to the water. Patrick called his mother in, read the numbers out loud. June sat at the table for a long moment, looking out the window at the fields she knew by heart. Every slope, every place where the soil changed texture, every spot where rainwater pooled before it drained. "Your grandfather chose this land because it had water," she said finally. "He used to say that good land always follows good water." She paused. He knew. Patrick looked at his mother. "Mom, if this becomes public, the aquifer, its location, its strategic value, the land can't be acquired quietly anymore. It becomes a matter of public interest. The state has an obligation to protect it." June looked at her son. "Then we need to make it public," she said. Patrick found the attorney through a colleague who had worked on an environmental law case in Omaha 2 years earlier. Her name was Clara Nguyen, 41 years old. Omaha-based practice specializing in environmental law and rural property rights. Daughter of Vietnamese refugees who had settled in Nebraska in the 1980s, worked on farms for a decade before opening a small restaurant. Clara had grown up understanding what it meant to have something real and watch someone more powerful try to take it. She met June and Patrick at her office on a Wednesday morning, listened to everything, examined the photos with the metadata, read the hydrological study, read the Department of Water Resources report. Then she was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet June recognized as someone organizing pieces, not someone without an answer. "There are 3 fronts here," Clara said finally. "The first is the most immediate, contesting the environmental notice. The photos with GPS coordinates and timestamps are direct proof that the violation didn't occur. And the documented integrated pest management history from 2019 eliminates the possibility of a Class 2 pesticide on the property. This front is strong and relatively fast." "How long?" Patrick asked. "To file the contest, 1 week. For the department to respond, 30 to 60 days. For a favorable ruling, My estimate is 90 days total. The second front? June asked. Investigating the origin of the false notice. Someone inserted incorrect data into a state regulatory system. That's falsification of a public record. A crime in Nebraska. I'll request through public records the access log for the Department of Natural Resources violation system. For the date the entry was made. If there's a connection to Agricor or anyone associated with them, we have grounds for a criminal complaint on top of the civil case. June and Patrick looked at each other. And the third front? June asked. Clara opened the hydrological study on the table between them, making the aquifer public, the right way. She explained, if we submit the documents to the Department of Water Resources with a formal request for protective classification, the state is required to initiate a public interest evaluation. During that evaluation, any transfer of property over the affected area requires department approval, which means Agricor cannot buy, pressure, or in any other way acquire the Hartwell farm while the evaluation is ongoing. How long does the evaluation take? Between 6 and 18 months. Clara paused. Long enough for the situation to resolve itself in other ways. June looked out the window of the office at the Omaha street below. She thought about Edmund buying that land in 1937, about her father Robert planting wheat the first year, about Thomas. Muddy boots, Southfield, October. We do all three, she said. At the same time, Clara Nguyen filed the public records request with the Nebraska Department of Natural Resources that same week. The request was technical and precise. Complete access log for the Environmental Violation Registry System for the property identified by the Hartwell Farm parcel number, including date, time, IP address of origin, and the user credential used to enter the September 14th violation record. The department had 15 business days to respond. They responded in 11. Clara called June on a Thursday morning. June was in the Northfield checking the irrigation. She answered with her work glove still on her hand. We have the access data, Clara said, and the violation was entered into the system on September 22nd, 2024 at 11:34 in the morning. The credential used belongs to a department inspector named Roy Sutter, assigned to the Omaha Regional Office for the past 6 years. Do you know the name? I didn't. But I ran a basic search. Roy Sutter has a professional profile listing as prior experience between 2015 and 2018, a position as regulatory compliance consultant at a company called Land Bridge Advisory Group. June went quiet. I don't know that name, she said. I looked it up. Land Bridge Advisory Group was dissolved in 2019. But its 2 founding partners appear as regional directors at Agricor Holdings, starting in 2020. The silence this time ran longer. Is he still at the department? June asked. Yes. As far as I can tell, no formal irregularities on record. Clara, is this enough for the criminal complaint? It's enough to start. I'll forward everything to the Douglas County District Attorney with the full documentation. The criminal investigation is theirs. We hand them the map. A pause. But there's something else you need to know. Tell me. I ran a search on the other properties in the aquifer band. There are 3 total. The other 2 have already been acquired by Agricor. One in 2022, another in March of this year. Clara paused. In both cases, the previous owners reported regulatory difficulties before selling. Environmental notices, licensing issues, problems that disappeared once the sale went through. June stood in the Northfield with the phone in her hand, and the October sun warming her back. She was the last one. The last property over the aquifer. The last one that hadn't given in. And the only one who had been out photographing birds on the wrong day. "We keep going on all 3 fronts," June said. "And add a 4th. Which one?" "I want the other 2 property owners to know what happened to them." Clara submitted the formal protection evaluation request to the Nebraska Department of Water Resources the following week. The document attached the 2021 hydrological study, the 2023 report, the precise coordinates of the aquifer formation, and a technical analysis prepared by a hydrogeologist Clara had retained as an expert witness, confirming the strategic importance of the formation and its concentration directly beneath the Hartwell farm. The protocol was clear. Once the request was formally accepted, the state was required to initiate a public interest evaluation. During that evaluation, any property transfer over the affected area required department approval, which in practice meant Agricor could not by pressure or in any other way acquire the Hartwell farm while the evaluation was in progress. The request was accepted in 7 days. Brett Callahan, Agricor's representative, called June's cell phone the morning after the acceptance was confirmed. The tone was different from his earlier visits. Faster, less rehearsed. "Mrs. Hartwell, I understand there's been a filing with the Department of Water Resources. I believe there may be a misunderstanding about Agricor's intentions regarding your property. We'd like to set up a meeting to clarify things." June was in the kitchen, coffee in hand, looking out the window at the lone oak in the north field, the same one that showed up in the photos from September 14th. "Mr. Callahan," she said, "all future communications need to go through my attorney. You have her contact information." She hung up before he could respond, set her coffee on the table, sat down, looked at the oak for a moment, then picked up her camera from the kitchen drawer and went outside to photograph birds. Clara located the 2 previous property owners within 2 weeks. The first was Harold Vance, 71 years old, who had sold 220 adjacent acres to Agricor in March of 2024. Harold was now living in an Omaha apartment when Clara called and explained what she'd uncovered about the aquifer and about the pattern of regulatory pressure used against all 3 properties. Harold was quiet for a considerable stretch of time. "I received 3 notices in 6 months, he said finally. "Zoning violations, fence line issues, a problem with my well permit." He paused. "I was 71 years old. I was alone, and my attorney told me the legal fight would cost more than the difference in the offer, so I sold." "Do you still have the notices?" "I kept everything. I never threw any of it out because I never understood where it came from." The second was Sandra Kowalski, 58 years old, widowed, who had sold 160 acres in 2022. She'd moved to Minneapolis to be near her daughter. When Clara explained the situation, Sandra was direct. "I knew something was wrong. I just couldn't prove it. And I was exhausted, and I was alone." A pause. "If there's any way to hold these people accountable, I'll cooperate with whatever you need." Clara now had 3 cases with the same pattern, 3 properties, 3 sequences of artificial regulatory notices, 3 sales completed under documentable pressure. She assembled the complete dossier and forwarded it simultaneously to the Douglas County District Attorney and to the Nebraska Attorney General. The Attorney General responded in 4 days. The Nebraska Attorney General was a woman named Patricia Drummond, 52 years old, 20 years of public legal career. The kind of person who had built her reputation on not opening investigations she couldn't finish. She finished this one in 4 months. The investigation ran 3 simultaneous lines. The first was Roy Sutter, the Department of Natural Resources inspector, who had entered the false violation into the system on September 22nd, when investigators from the Attorney General's office arrived at his Omaha office with a subpoena for deposition. Roy Sutter filed for medical leave that same afternoon. The attorney he hired the following morning had previously worked for Landbridge Advisory Group, the company that connected Sutter to Agricor. The coincidence was noted in the investigation files. Sutter cooperated partially 3 weeks later, after his attorney negotiated partial immunity in exchange for testimony. What he said confirmed everything Clara had suspected. He had been contacted by a regional director at Agricor in August of 2024 and offered $15,000 in cash to insert violation notices into the regulatory system for specific properties. He had done the same thing for the Vance and Kowalski properties in prior years. $15,000 per farm, for each of the 3 properties over the aquifer. The second line was Agricor Holdings itself. Investigators subpoenaed internal communications related to all 3 properties. Agricor fought back through attorneys for 6 weeks before a court order forced partial disclosure. What came back in the emails was enough. There was a communication chain between 2 regional directors, the former Landbridge partners, and an Agricor VP of Asset Development based in Dallas named Douglas Merritt, 49 years old. The emails discussed all 3 properties using language that the Attorney General described publicly, very carefully, as indicative of coordinated intent to apply artificial regulatory pressure. In plain language, they knew exactly what they were doing, and they had been putting it in writing. Douglas Merritt was indicted on 3 counts of conspiracy to falsify public records and 1 count of interference with a state regulatory process. The 2 regional directors were indicted on the same counts. Roy Sutter was indicted for falsification of a public record, with his partial cooperation formally acknowledged by the prosecution. The third line was the quietest and the most consequential. The Nebraska Department of Water Resources, working from the evaluation documents Clara had submitted, initiated a formal process to classify the aquifer formation as a strategic public interest water resource. Once finalized, that classification would make any commercial exploitation of the aquifer subject to permanent state approval and oversight, which meant that even if Agricor owned the land, and it did own 380 acres of the other 2 properties, it could not access the water without state authorization, and the state was not inclined to authorize anything while 3 indictments involving the company were pending. The asset that had cost $15,000 per farm to try to acquire was, in practice, completely out of reach. The Hartwell Farms environmental notice was formally dismissed by the Department of Natural Resources in November of 2024. The violation was removed from the record. The $47,000 penalty was canceled. The department opened an internal administrative investigation into how the violation had been entered into the system. Roy Sutter was suspended without pay during the investigation and subsequently terminated. Harold Vance retained an Omaha attorney to evaluate whether there were grounds to void the sale of his property based on documented coercion. The case was ongoing. Clara hadn't taken it, but she had provided every relevant document at no charge. Sandra Kowalski did the same from Minneapolis. In December of 2024, a reporter from the Omaha World Herald named James O'Burt published a front-page investigative piece. The headline read, "The Water Beneath: How an Agribusiness Corporation Used Fake Environmental Violations to Seize Nebraska Farmland." The story was picked up by the Associated Press and distributed to 340 outlets across 31 states. Patrick called his mother when he saw the headline online at 6 in the morning on the day it published. "Mom, it's on the AP." "I saw." June said. She was already outside, as always in the morning. "How are you doing?" June looked out at the fields. The sun was coming up behind Edmund's barn. That specific Nebraska December light. Cold, horizontal. The kind that makes everything sharper than it actually is. "I'm fine," she said. "The fields are fine." That was enough. In March of 2025, the Nebraska Department of Water Resources completed its preliminary evaluation and issued the formal protective classification for the aquifer. The Hartwell Farm, all 180 acres sitting over the point of greatest concentration, was included in a state water resource conservation program. The program provided annual financial compensation to landowners over protected aquifers in exchange for sustainable management commitments. The compensation established for the Hartwell Farm, $43,000 per year, adjusted annually for inflation, for an indefinite period, as long as the protective classification remained in effect. Clara called June with the number. $43,000 a year, June repeated, for the foreseeable future, which could be decades. June was quiet for a moment. Edmund paid $4,200 for this land in 1937, she said. Worked 11 years on a railroad to save it. She paused. He knew the land was good. Clara didn't respond right away. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said finally, "can I ask you something personal?" "Go ahead." "When Brett Callahan showed up that first time with the offer, did you ever consider selling?" June was quiet for a stretch of time. "For about 3 seconds," she said. "Until I remembered that my husband died on that land, in muddy work boots, fixing a fence post. Duck." She paused. "A man who dies working his own land didn't die badly, and I wasn't about to sell the place where he died well for $2.25 million from people in Dallas." Clara laughed. It was the first time June had heard her laugh. Douglas Merritt, VP of Asset Development at Agricor Holdings, pleaded not guilty on all counts in January of 2025. Trial was scheduled for September of 2025. The 2 regional directors, former partners at Landbridge Advisory Group, reached a plea agreement with the prosecution in February, suspended sentences in exchange for full cooperation in the case against Merritt. Agricor Holdings issued a statement in March saying that the actions of those indicted had occurred, quote, "without the knowledge or approval of corporate leadership, and that the company was committed to ethical rural asset development practices." The statement did not mention Harold Vance, did not mention Sandra Kowalski, did not mention Edmund Hartwell, who had bought that land in 1937 for $4,200 in cash after 11 years on a railroad. In April of 2025, Patrick came to visit his mother for a weekend. He brought his kids, June's grandchildren, 8 and 10 years old, for the first time since winter. On Saturday morning, June went out with her camera the way she always did. The 2 grandchildren went with her. She showed the younger one where the red-tailed hawk usually perched in the lone oak in the north field. He stood completely still and waited for 23 minutes. With the patience of someone learning that some things only show up when you wait the right way. The hawk landed. June took the photo. GPS, timestamp, coordinates, all of it recorded.
June Hartwell didn't have a legal team. She didn't have corporate resources. She didn't have a single thing that a Dallas corporation with offices in 11 states didn't have more of than she did. What she had was an old camera, a 21-year habit, and the memory of a man who chose that land because he knew that good land always follows good water. They picked the wrong day because June went out every Saturday for 21 years without fail. And the lesson here, it's not really about farms or aquifers or corporations from Dallas. It's about this, the habits you keep in silence, the things you do without an audience, without approval, without recognition. Sometimes, those are exactly what saves everything that matters when someone more powerful decides that what's yours should be theirs. Walt had a black notebook. Damon had a personal email account. June had a camera and 21 years of Saturdays. None of them planned to defend themselves. They just lived with integrity. And when the moment came, the integrity had receipts. 3 stories, 3 completely different people. 3 moments where someone with more power, more money, or more institutional authority decided they could just erase. A 58-year-old janitor walked out in front of 40 kids. An analyst let go 4 days after an honest email. A 62-year-old farmer handed a $47,000 fine for something she never did. And you know what all 3 of them have in common? Not one of them went after revenge. Walt wanted to get back to the kids. Damon wanted 847 people to get back what was theirs. June wanted the land to stay exactly where it had always been. It was never about destroying the people who knocked them down. It was about rebuilding what was real. And I keep thinking, how many stories like these do we never get to hear? How many Walts signed the confidentiality agreement? How many Junes sold because they were exhausted and alone and didn't know there was another way? That's why these stories matter. Not for the anger, for the memory. So that when your moment comes, and for a lot of you watching right now, it already has, you know there's a way through that doesn't go by way of surrender. In the next video, I'm going to tell you about a woman who spent 11 years auditing the finances of a family-owned company. She was fired the week she discovered something the owners never wanted anyone to find out. Except she had already sent the report, and the person she sent it to was not who they thought it was. That video is going to leave you speechless. I'll see you there.